Hi, everybody. It's been a while since we've had an episode of the podcast. I went with my wife, Linda, to Switzerland and France to hike in the Alps. But on that last day in Chamonix, France, I caught COVID, which unfortunately nearly took my life. I was in and out of the hospital for 3 months in September, October, and November, including time in the ICU because my lungs were so inflamed that I could hardly breathe. Many of you knew of this and were praying for me, and I thank you so much. It was really touch and go for a while there. So I'm confident that the Lord answered all of your prayers.
Yes, and we're so happy to be back and recording. We're also so thankful for Bob's health and that he is back and he's able to record and keep pushing this mission forward. It was a scary time, and we had a lot of prayers and a lot of conversations back and forth and texting in between this time. And obviously we had to cancel several of our interviews that we had scheduled at the end of 2023, which stunk. I mean, it wasn't fun for either of us to have to miss that, and for the guests as well. But it's 2024. Bob is off the oxygen, and he's going through some rigorous physical therapy with his wife, Linda. If you know Linda, you know that she's making him do everything manageable to keep updated with his health. And he's able to once again co-host this podcast. So we're so happy to be back.
Yes, we are. Thanks for coming back with us. Hope you enjoy today's episode. We have a great guest. His name is Daniel G. Hummel, PhD. Daniel is the director of the Lumen Center, located at University Square on the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The Lumen Center is a community of Christian scholars working at the intersection of Christianity and culture. Daniel has held appointments at the UW-Madison and Harvard University. He's the author of the new book, The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism: How the Evangelical Battle Over the End Times Shaped a Nation, published by Erdman's Press in 2023.
So here is our interview with Daniel Hummel.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Dan.
Good to meet you all.
Good to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you.
Where are you guys located?
The Pro Football Hall of Fame is like 10 minutes from where we live.
Oh, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I'm here. I'm in Madison, and we got a ton of snow today. I've been at home all day with little kids, and
Oh, really?
Whole town shut down. Yeah.
Nice. Did you get to go out and play?
We did. Yeah, it's like high 20s, so it's really nice weather to be playing in the snow. Very wet snow. But they did they like canceled the trash service today. Things I've lived here for a while, and maybe it was an overreaction. I'm not sure, but interesting anyway.
I would think Wisconsin is kind of used to snow.
You think so, but
yeah, I feel like that's more of like a Tennessee or like something somewhere down south where they shut everything down.
Right, for an inch or something. Yeah.
Right.
How old are your kids?
We have twin 3-year-olds and a 1-year-old, so it's a very active little group of guys, and they're all boys. So
First time for snow, or the 3-year-olds probably seen snow before?
Yeah, they saw it. Yeah, I mean, they don't really remember a year before, but yeah, they like it. We were out. We had a smaller snow a couple weeks ago. We were out in it, but this is like a real up to their knees type snow. So
that's a blast. That's so fun. It's so fun. Congratulations on that. That's fun.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we just got a lot of rain. It would have been pretty if it was snow, but
it's the worst. It just rained and rained and rained all day.
Cold, windy, and rainy.
Could it be just a few temperature a little lower so we could have beautiful snow? It's just rain.
Right.
Gross.
Yeah.
That's gross. So thanks for your book.
Yeah. I appreciate the interest.
Let's jump into this, shall we?
All right. Welcome to the Reintegrate podcast, Daniel.
Happy to be with both of you.
So we'll want to get into our personal stories about what our experiences have been with dispensational theology. But before we do that, we need to understand what we're even talking about. So can you explain to us what dispensationalism is? That term might not be really familiar to some of us. So though many probably have heard of the Rapture and Armageddon, can you put a definition here for us?
Sure. And there's probably two ways you could define it. One would be theologically, and the other would be more sociologically, sort of who is a dispensationalist. So in terms of theologically, dispensationalism is a system of theology. So it touches on all aspects of how to read the Bible, of doctrines around the church and salvation and eschatology, which is the big one around the end times. But it is not simply a view of the end times, which is often how it's portrayed to outsiders, that dispensations are totally fixated on what's going to happen next. There's definitely an element to that, but more foundational is a commitment to a certain way of reading the Bible that has been called variously literalistic reading, or a plain reading of the text, or a consistent historical grammatical reading. That's a more seminary language, but it's a commitment to read all aspects of the Bible in a plain way that particularly has relevance around the prophecy or the prophetic books of the Bible. So think of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, or think of the book of Daniel, or the book of Revelation as apocalyptic. And there's a commitment to read those literally, or in the sense that the visions and fulfillments of those visions will happen in space-time in like an observable way that you could write a news report about. And so the sort of scenario of what's going to happen in the future follows a very literalistic way of reading prophetic texts and looking for fulfillments in the news and other things like that. But there are other big commitments that dispensationalists have theologically. Probably the most important one is a distinction they maintain between what they call the church and Israel, and particularly that is seeing the nation of Israel, the ancient nation of Israel, and the modern day state of Israel, and the Jewish people who existed in between those two, as part of a continuous covenanted people with God. And so there's really two chosen peoples for dispensationalists. There's Israel, and then there's the church, which is a separate entity that emerges after the ministry of Jesus and has a separate destiny from the nation of Israel. Most Christians certainly throughout church history, have seen Israel and the church in continuity, or that God worked through ancient Israel and then he works through the church today, and there's a sort of continuity to the story. For dispensationalists, there is you could say a discontinuity between the peoples of God, and there's also a discontinuity in how that story progresses, and that's where the term dispensationalism comes from. It's dividing up time into dispensations, or particular periods of time where God works with either Israel or the church in unique ways. So that's the sort of overriding theological system. Sociologically, dispensationalists tend to be American, though that's not exclusive because of missions work and other travel and media. There are dispensationalists all around the globe, but it's certainly headquartered and its center of gravity is in the United States. It tends to be on the conservative Protestant side of American Christianity, particularly popular in independent Baptist circles and non-denominational circles, and some Pentecostal and charismatic circles. Historically, it was popular among Presbyterians and Congregationalists. That's like 100 or 150 years ago. Less so today. And it's for most of its history, it's been largely a white and middle class led movement as well. So when you're looking around, those would be some of the places that would still even today claim a lot of dispensationalists in their pews and among their pastors and in their seminaries.
You said about eschatology, the end times is like a big thing with them, mainly because of evangelism and mission. It's like, Jesus is coming back. The rapture is going to happen. Don't you want to get right with God so that you could be with us, right? And it's a great evangelistic tool to be able to tell people that. So what is this dispensation? What is the timeline that dispensationalists believe is going to happen at the end times?
Right. Yeah. And historically, dispensationalists have been at the forefront of the global missions movement, at least in the Protestant world. So going all the way back to the 19th century, they founded many of the missions agencies that are still active today. Yeah, so that because of that commitment to reading the Bible in a certain way, they have a you could say a very distinct timeline that they're looking for. The first thing to happen is the rapture. It's sort of an any moment event. It could happen at any time. And in that moment, all of the Christians, the true believers, will be taken up into heaven with Jesus, and then that'll kick off a 7-year timeline of just really horrible things happening to the earth and the people remaining on the earth. And those horrible things are where they're interpreting parts of the book of Daniel and book of Revelation in particular in what they would say is a literalistic way, or that when there are 7 seals broken, well, each of these seals corresponds to some event on earth that's happening. And in that timeline, there will be a number of things that happen, including plagues and wars and a false peace treaty with Israel that will sort of destroy much of the modern state of Israel. There's going to be this figure called the Antichrist, who will be a specific individual. So it'll be like a human who basically is the embodiment of evil, and will take over the globe in some type of one world dictatorship. He will force all people that are left, including the people who convert to Christianity after the rapture, to take a mark of the beast, which will be a literal sort of something on your body that will show that you're in allegiance to this dictator. And further horrible things will happen. And at the end of this 7 years, there will be the Battle of Armageddon, which will actually take place, you could say literally in Israel, in a place called Tel Megiddo. That's where most dispensationalists expect it to happen. And this will be a battle between all the forces of the Antichrist and the forces of good, of Jesus. Jesus will come back with all the raptured Christians, and Jesus will win and set up his millennial kingdom. And then that will kick off 1,000 years of peace in the city of Jerusalem as the capital of the millennial kingdom. So you could say this is the standard timeline. There are many debates within the dispensationalist world about specific parts of this scenario and exactly who the Antichrist is, exactly how it's all going to shape out. But that is the basic timeline. And if you've ever read the Left Behind novels, or you've watched one of the many Left Behind movies, or there's actually a lot of other less popular movies as well. A Thief in the Night was a very popular one in the 70s and 80s. They are pulling from this plot line to depict their stories. And so there's a whole sort of subgenre of end times film in the sort of Christian art world that is entirely beholden to this dispensationalist end time scenario.
Yeah, I know for me, my kind of background with learning all of this was informed a lot by the Left Behind series in school, reading those books, watching the movies. I feel like there was just a lot of fear, I think, when I was younger around this topic, around a lot of what the Christian media portrayed. Oh man, there's no good that comes out of this but fear. Like, I'm just going to wake up one day, everyone's going to be raptured up, and I'm going to be left here, and I'm going to maybe meet Kirk Cameron and have my own side plot in the Left Behind movie. But so speaking of the Left Behind books and movies, there are these manifestations of what you call in the book pop dispensationalism, which started with Hal Lindsey's 1970 book, The Late Great Planet Earth. And ever since, we have seen a lot of books, movies, and music in that vein. So what is the relation and distinctions between what you call pop dispensationalism of commercialized media and the scholastic dispensationalism that was found in seminaries and Bible colleges?
Sure. And David, we probably are somewhat of the same age. I grew up on the Left Behind novels as well. I was actually in Colorado Springs as a kid, which was where Jerry Jenkins, one of the co-authors, lived as well. And we actually attended the same megachurch when I was in my early teens. And so I remember and this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. So right when all those books were coming out and topping the charts. So I have a few of them signed by him. They were signings at Focus on the Family headquarters, which were also in Colorado Springs. So maybe that just gives a sense of how deep into this subculture I was as a kid. I didn't really recognize it at the time. But yeah, and I would say, even though I went to a church that at the time I I assume, taught dispensationalism in a very megachurch way. So you're not sort of hitting people over the head with systematic theology, but it was sort of the assumed theology. I was really more formed by pop dispensationalism, more by the commercialized, the movies, the TV expressions, the books. I even think of like in contemporary Christian contemporary music, there was a lot of and Rapture songs. I remember one that was popular in the '90s was "People Get Ready, Jesus is Coming" by Crystal Lewis. It was, I think it was '95 or '96 when that was on the top of the charts, and that's all pop dispensationalism. So what I wanted to make a distinction from between more academic seminarian type dispensationalism and pop is that what most Americans, whether they're in the evangelical world or beyond it, what they've mostly encountered is the pop dispensationalist version of dispensationalism, and that is a version that is indebted to the dense theological system, but is really more about spinning a profitable and compelling account of the Bible, of the world, of where we find ourselves in the world, and really to entertain us for a lot of it. And that entertainment is often couched as an evangelistic entertainment. It's to get people interested in the Bible or interested in Christianity. Hal Lindsey, that book you mentioned, The Late Great Planet Earth, the best-selling nonfiction book of the 1970s in the U.S. I mean, it ended with a call to convert, to pray the sinner's prayer, welcome Jesus into your life. So he had that in mind as well. This was a very popularized version of the end time scenario that talked a lot about 1970s politics and oil politics and all that kind of stuff. But I'm pretty critical of pop dispensationalism, in part because it really thinned out and diluted any type of deeper theological or ethical engagement with the Bible, you could say, in some ways. It was very focused. It is very focused on correlating what's happening in the world, in the Middle East in particular, with biblical prophecy in order to make sort of claims of authority about this way of interpreting the Bible. And it is immensely profitable. At certain points, I think a big chunk of the entire evangelical subculture has been circulating around dispensationalism, and particularly moments of war in the Middle East. I think of the first Gulf War in the early 90s. There was just a mad rush to publish as many books as possible, linking Saddam Hussein to the Antichrist and everything else around that scenario. And a lot of people profit from that. A lot of people gain notoriety from that. And you have to, if you pull back, you have to wonder, like, what is the actual formational benefit of this to the average Christian, even to the average American, who ends up associating this type of thinking about the world with Christianity writ large. And that's one of the ways you can see the influence of pop dispensationalism, is when you go to entirely non-Christian portrayals of evangelicalism, they often default to a dispensationalist reading of the Bible, a dispensationalist understanding of the end times as the stand-in for what Christians believe in general. And I talk about that a bit in the book. There's some comedy movies that have come out in recent decades that are like end of the world comedies, and they're basically making fun of dispensationalism, but it's a stand-in for Christian eschatology. And that's really one of the legacies, at least, of pop dispensationalism. Another one, which we can get into if you want, is the political legacy, which is there's been a lot of political organizing and activism invoking dispensationalist categories by people like Tim LaHaye and Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and some of the big names in conservative evangelical politics. And they have also come out of this tradition. And that's been another way that a very, I would say, thin understanding of eschatology has spread to just millions and millions of Americans who may not have never even heard the term dispensationalism, but definitely think there's something to it, even if they don't know where it comes from.
I came to faith in the late 80s in a dispensational church. And so my two pastoral mentors, one was a graduate from Grace Theological Seminary, the other one was from Dallas Theological Seminary. I deeply respect them to this day. I love them. But it was like the milieu in which I lived, and I didn't even know what it was, because I just went to church here, and this is what they say, and this is what it's all about. And so, when the Iraq war broke out, it's like Walvoord republished his book, Armageddon, Oil in the Middle East Crisis. And I read that and was like, oh, that's kind of like a mixture of pop and scholastic dispensationalism, where it's a scholastic, it's an academic, the president of Dallas Seminary writing something that's trying to be Hal Lindsey, isn't it?
That's right. And I'm pretty, and he's not as good at it. Like, it sold a lot of copies. It paled in comparison to the book sales that Hal Lindsey had. Even around the early 90s, Lindsey released his own, analysis of the Middle East at that point and sold way more than Walvoord's book did. But yeah, John Walvoord's this massive figure in the history of more scholarly dispensationalism. He was trained at Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, which is the citadel of dispensationalist, seminary training. And then he ended up leading Dallas Seminary after its founder passed away in, I believe it was 1952, and he led the institution until 1986. So for more than
grew like crazy under him.
Oh yeah, right? It became the largest seminary in the country under Walvoord's leadership, and in terms of student numbers, and so thousands and thousands of pastors were indebted to either Walvoord personally or to the institution he ran. And so he was someone who really stewarded this much more learned, academic, wanted to be taken as seriously as any other theologian in the country, even as dispensationalism was seen by many outsiders as a weird sort of fundamentalist tradition. He was part of the movement that really tried to make it respectable. And yet, at various points, he dipped into, this is how I would portray it, he dipped into the pop side of this. In part because there was just such an audience for it. I think there was a concern by some of these more academic dispensationalists that if they didn't engage in this, they would leave it only up to the sensationalists and the people out to make a lot of money, right. And they wanted to do it in a little more respectable way. I also think there was an ideal that they wanted the audience that came with selling books that were really timely and claimed to be able to decode what's happening in the world. So Walvoord to me is sort of a tragic figure in that sense, and that at various multiple times, I mean, that book Armageddon, Oil in the Middle East, comes out 3 times. It comes out in 1974, right after the Arab-Israeli War in 1973. It comes out again in 1990, right into the lead up to the first Gulf War, and then it comes out again in 2002 as there's anticipating the second Gulf War. And actually, Walvoord passes away before the second Gulf War, but once again, it's trying to capitalize on that war. So, yeah, he's maybe an interesting bridge figure between these two cultures, and very fascinating for that reason.
Yeah. So my first Bible was the Ryrie Study Bible. What fascinated me at that time, it was a very dense, academically interesting way of studying the Bible. It's like, here's everything you need to know. We figured it out, and here's how it all fits together. And this is the dispensation that does this, and this is the dispensation that does this. And you're like, your head's just spinning, but it's like, I got to figure this all out. But Ryrie's got it figured out. So I'm going to just read the study Bible. I was going to Dallas Seminary. I was planning to do that. I ended up going to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where I was exposed to a wider range of ideas. There was like the Feinberg brothers were about the only dispensationalists there. So I was able to like move beyond dispensationalism once I was in seminary at TEDS. But interestingly, it was because of that dispensational excited time when I was a new believer with my Ryrie Study Bible that I got into my Bible, and I loved it, and I wanted to learn more. And so I'm indebted to it too. It's kind of interesting.
I'm totally there with you. My dad got a degree from Dallas Seminary. I come from families on both sides, both my mom and my dad, who were dispensationalists growing up. And yeah, if nothing else, it gave me a love of the Bible and a high view of the Bible. Wanting to sort of learn as much as I could because I believed this was the Word of God. And I grew up a missionary kid as well. So, we were living out that ideal that we talked about, which was right. That dispensationalists have been very committed to mission. So I was in Germany for a number of years as a kid. And I remember, I mean, this is one of the things I really loved about growing up in that culture was I remember most of us have a refrigerator with a lot of pictures on it of family. And if you're in a Christian home or religious home, you might, think about praying for the people on your fridge every once in a while. And anyway, mine, because we came out of an entire missionary culture, it wasn't just like my family was the one. I had aunts and uncles who were missionaries, tons of friends of my parents. I would look on that fridge and I would see people from around the globe. Even when I was a little kid, I would see people from Kenya. I had an uncle and aunt who were in Brazil. Another good friend of my mom's was in Thailand. And so you just grow up with a much different sense, and growing up out of country for a while, just a much different sense of the breadth and scope of the globe, of all the different types of people. I think it's one reason I was interested in history, and then particularly diplomatic history, sort of history of, international relations and other things, is because I just grew up with a mindset that was a little different because of that sort of imagination I had as a young kid, and I really thank my upbringing for that too, because I don't take it for granted that most kids in the U.S. do not do that. Most kids don't go outside the country until they're an adult.
Well, you received your PhD in history, so we want to dive into a brief history of the development of dispensational theology. Can you help us understand, where did this all start, and where did it come from, and who are the major figures that made it grow, and what has become basically the default theology of the average American Christian? So how did we get here?
Yeah, and it's an interesting story. It's not expected, you could say. It starts on the fringes of British dissenter Protestantism. So it starts with a guy named John Nelson Darby, who was the founder of the Exclusive Brethren, or the Plymouth Brethren movement. And that's in the 1830s, 1840s is when he's doing his first writing. He was born earlier than that. And I think it's really interesting that he was an Anglican priest before he created his own movement. And he was really disaffected by, in the simplest terms, by the way that he understood the Church of England, the Church of Ireland, the Anglican Church, as being entirely co-opted by the British Empire. And so he was strongly critical of state churches, and particularly of the Anglican Church. And he thought that in his own context that the church was actually operating more as an arm of the British Empire than it was as the Church of God. And so I think a lot of Christians today can sympathize with that critique. Now, the way Darby developed his response to that was by you could say, a radical rereading of the role of the church in the Bible. And that's where some of these distinctions that I mentioned already around between the church and Israel and a certain way to read prophecy really become foundations to the movement he's creating and the way he's teaching this theology. So he develops many of the distinctives that we've already talked about. That's when we see him start to mention the rapture, start to mention this idea that the church should be entirely otherworldly, that it should be totally separated from any type of involvement with governments or politics or anything else. And that's what the Brethren movement, which is founded right around this time as well, really starts teaching and creating a movement. The Brethren split in 1848, and then there's the Open Brethren and the Exclusive Brethren, and Darby's the head of the Exclusive Brethren. And that should give you just a sense. Darby was probably a genius. I mean, he was a very productive and winsome person. He was also very combative and created enemies everywhere he went. And so his own movement splits. He becomes basically the major figure in the Plymouth Brethren movement. And part of what he's able to do at that point is, he's also a lifelong bachelor, by the way. So he's traveling his entire life. He's just basically moving around, evangelizing, building the movement. He ends up spending 7 years in the United States in the 1860s and 1870s. Interestingly enough, the first time he's in the U.S. is in 1863. Which is right in the middle of the Civil War. So he's getting a very interesting look at what it is to be an American in 1863. And what's interesting to me is he was actually not a compelling speaker or writer, but he had the right ideas for certain people at the right time. And particularly this idea of an otherworldly church, the idea that the church is entirely heavenly minded. It should never be involved in politics. It should never be co-opted by the state. There were certain Americans, particularly during the Civil War and right after, that this really resonated with them, because their worlds were entirely political, were entirely bound up, even in the 1850s and 1840s, in the question of slavery and secession. And so the most important figure that really adopts some of these ideas is a guy named James Brooks, who's a pastor in St. Louis, which is a really problematic area for the Civil War era time, because Missouri is a state that's got slaveholders and free, and they're being pulled by both sides of the Civil War. And Brooks is just looking for, I mean, it's not this cynical, but one thing Brooks is looking for is like, what's a theology that can get me out of some of these netty issues, because he believed that the church was really called to do evangelization and to disciple Christians. And so he becomes interested in Darby, basically on this issue of the church, much more than on the end time stuff. He actually writes later about how he converted to a premillennial eschatology, which is what dispensationalism is, after he had actually decided his views on the church. And so Brooks becomes the figurehead of this adoption of Darby's teachings in the U.S. and spreads it throughout the Bible conference movement. Within James Brooks's orbit is a younger guy named Dwight Moody, who becomes the biggest revivalist in America in the 1870s through the 1890s. And Moody ends up adopting, in a simplistic way, Moody was not a theologian, he was a preacher and a revivalist, but he ends up adopting the idea of the rapture, the idea of the otherworldly church, some other things as well that are distinctive. The way that to read the Bible is more literal. These are distinctives of dispensationalism. Moody makes these sort of old-time gospel branded. Like once Moody's preaching them, it just feels like this is sort of the default of a certain type of very revivalistic, conservative Protestantism. So this is the era when dispensationalists start creating institutions. They start creating more Bible conferences. They start building this massive network of Bible institutes, which are these short-term schools that are intended to train missionaries and get them out onto the field as quickly as possible. But those, of course, turn into Bible colleges. And then today, many of the big Christian colleges in the U.S. find their roots in these Bible institutes from the 19th century. And then they also create mission agencies. And so you could say by the year 1900, the spine or the backbone of evangelicalism writ large, these institutions that are basically what are, pumping thousands of people through them and building training the pastors, sending out missionaries, they are indebted to dispensationalists in many ways. And that doesn't persist through the whole 20th century, but for a period, particularly around the turn of the 20th century, dispensationalists were sort of at the establishment and at the center of what it meant to be an evangelical in the United States.
Even to this day, Moody Bible Institute is a huge influence on American Christians. Moody Radio is everywhere, right? And so
Right.
It's still, but it's like one of the few dispensational institutions that remains, right?
That's right. So there, over the 20th century, one of the stories is that a number of the organizations and certainly seminaries and colleges that were founded as dispensationalists have moved away from that theology. So you can think of Moody. Yeah, as you said, Moody is maybe an exception. They maintain a pretty strong continuity with their history. But you could think of another one like Biola University. Biola University is in the LA area. It's one of the bigger Christian colleges in the country. It's an acronym for Bible Institute of Los Angeles. So it was founded in 1908 by dispensationalists to train missionaries in the dispensationalist system to go out and be missionaries. And today, Biola is not dispensationalist. It is still evangelical. It's still quite conservative theologically. And that change happened slowly, you could say, or gradually for Biola. But today, you wouldn't associate that except in a historical way with that school. They do have a seminary there, Talbot Theological Seminary, named after someone named Louis Talbot, who was a major dispensationalist writer in the 1930s, 1940s. And even there, it's unclear to me. On paper, there's still an insistence by faculty that they need to hold to certain teachings that are pretty distinctly dispensationalist. But the newest dean of Talbot Seminary is a guy named Ed Stetzer, who is not a dispensationalist. And so it seems like the culture there is drifting, at least maybe not drifting, maybe it's broadening. Maybe that's the way to say it. But that's just one example. There are literally dozens of examples of this across the country. One that's not a seminary is actually, I go to an evangelical free church here in Madison, and the Evangelical Free Church of America is a denomination that was founded in 1950 almost exclusively by dispensationalists. And it's a really interesting story. It's more of an ethnic, it was the Norwegians and the Scandinavians who sort of came together, but they all were influenced by dispensationalism up to that point. But in 2019, they actually voted to remove premillennial from their statement of faith because the denomination had drifted so far away from that being a defining mark. Of course, they welcome premillennialists, but they welcome others as well. And that was a pretty significant change that just signaled in a denominational setting how dispensationalism has much less cachet today than it did in, say, 1950. I think it would have been very hard. I've studied the first president of the Evangelical Free Church a good amount. He was very into Israel as well. My first book was on Christian Zionism. His name was Arnold Olson. I think if you could go back to 1950 and talk to Arnold Olson about this, he would be very confused about why this. I think he would see it at that time as like a core part of the faith, that like there's a certain eschatology that Christians should have, and this is it. And there's a certain way of reading the Bible that Christians should have, and it's a dispensationalist way of reading the Bible. So I think it's quite significant that the Free Church has moved as well.
Yeah, I was a Free Church. I planted a church with the Evangelical Free Church back in 2001, and I remember sitting around in the Allegheny District pastoral meetings, and we would talk about this. It's like, should millennialism be part of our statement of faith? Is it really, really that significant? And we would debate it within, and they're like, maybe someday we'll change it. And then they did. I was like, wow, that's a big change. In the Evangelical Free Church, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School is their seminary. And so that school was founded as a dispensational school. And when I went, it wasn't a dispensational school. So you just see these things change. Dallas Theological Seminary is a dispensational school, but it has changed dramatically. Can you tell us some of the changes that has happened there?
Sure. Yeah. And this one is, I have my own take on this. I acknowledge there's others who would probably find more continuity at what's happened at Dallas, but Dallas Seminary was founded by a guy named Louis Sperry Schaefer, who was one of the founders, you could say. He wrote the 8-volume systematic theology of dispensationalism back in the 1940s. And I mentioned John Walvoord, who was there a long time. In the 80s, actually, there became a pretty strong critique of what is now called traditional dispensationalism or classical dispensationalism. And it emerged within Dallas Seminary. So some younger faculty there who really were the first ones to actually historicize the theology, to actually go back and trace a history of it that went back to Darby and then to people in between, including Cyrus Schofield, and the Schofield Reference Bible is a big part of that story. But these guys, people like Darrell Bach and Craig Blazing, those were two of the faculty. They ended up developing something that was called progressive dispensationalism, which is as the name implies, it sees itself in continuity with other dispensationalist history, but it really modifies a lot of the core teachings that we've talked about, and actually moves them closer to other evangelical traditions, particularly the more covenantal or the more covenantal theology that would be familiar to anyone who went to somewhere like Fuller Seminary or Gordon Conwell Seminary, or in the more reformed world, Calvin or Westminster Seminary. And so progressive dispensationalism was the really hot thing in the late 80s, 90s, 2000s. And as I read it, as sort of an intellectual historian, as I read this, I don't even know exactly. I know why it was called progressive dispensationalism, but it really doesn't feel like it's of the same tradition as much of the other parts of the dispensationalist world. And so that's become it's hard to know if that's the dominant view on the faculty at Dallas now, or if it's just a very loud or very strong minority view. But it's certainly a much different seminary than it was when Walvoord retired in 1986. And a lot of it has to do with this development of a pretty strong internal critique of where the theology was at, and then an attempt to try to adapt that without sort of rejecting that deeper history that really was, and in some ways still is, the calling card of Dallas Seminary, which is, this is where we're going to, teach dispensationalism.
Mm-hmm. As I'm just like sitting here listening to a lot of the history behind this, I just think to myself, Bob and I get to interview a lot of smarter people than we are. And this is one of those instances where I feel like I'm learning a lot on the history of this, because some things you said, I'm like, wow, I never knew that. That's crazy. There's an importance of a historical context here. And we've talked about the rise of dispensationalism. We've mentioned that pastors from Dallas, Grace, and Talbot, they were flooding pulpits and teaching this theology. But in the past 30 years and recent years, you've seen it collapsing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why dispensationalism is not as popular as it used to be on an academic or church level. As we've mentioned, I think there's still a lot of popularity in the culture. And I actually mean fall in a couple ways. One of them is what we've talked about, sort of the decline in the church world. I think another fall is just the thinness and the the vulgarity, you could say, of pop dispensationalism. But one story for why dispensationalism has collapsed or declined in seminary and church world is that there have been very sustained critiques of it from other parts of the evangelical world. And those critiques go back all the way to, all the way to the founding. In a sense, there was always a, sort of opposition to Darby's teachings, to Moody's teachings, even. But it particularly takes shape in the fundamentalist era. So in the 1920s and 1930s, everything gets sort of scrambled in terms of what was happening previously, and there become these two large factions, though we can overstate this, but there become the modernists and the fundamentalists, and this becomes sort of the culture war, the church war of the day. And dispensationalists are entirely in the fundamentalist side of that. They are conservative. They reject higher biblical criticism. They reject evolution, all the things that were associated with modernism. But within the fundamentalist world, that does not mean everyone agreed. There were multiple different traditions and strands of theology and denominations that were in the fundamentalist world. And actually, the term dispensationalism emerges from that moment. It doesn't have anything really to do with liberals or modernists critiquing dispensationalists. It's actually other fundamentalists who are identifying dispensationalism as problematic according to them. And so the most consistent critique has been from I mentioned it a while ago, a covenantalist theological tradition, which rejects the idea of dispensations, tends not to be premillennialist, tends to be what we call amillennialist, a less apocalyptic way of looking at eschatology. And there have been consistent critiques from the sort of very reformed world, Calvin and Westminster Seminary. Westminster Seminary, in many ways, is the rival to Dallas Seminary from a different theological tradition, both sort of vying for the heart of fundamentalism, you could say, or the heart of evangelicalism. Mm-hmm. But later on, there's really powerful critiques of dispensationalism from Fuller Seminary, from people like George Eldon Ladd, who is a very important New Testament scholar in the 1950s through the 1970s. And there's always been a consistent critique from British evangelicals, going all the way back to people like John Stott, to N.T. Wright today has been quite critical of dispensationalism in a number of his books. And so in some ways, I think these criticisms have stuck and landed and actually, struck blows to where dispensationalism is considered less intellectually credible in a lot of evangelical seminaries today. This type of theology, it certainly doesn't have as much purchase among younger evangelicals, but even among middle-aged evangelicals, it's seen as the problem in evangelicalism more than the solution. And it's ironic because at the same time, Left Behind is selling millions and millions of books. And so there's obviously something to it in a broader cultural sense. But in terms of trying to analyze what evangelical churches need and what evangelical life of the mind needs, it's been seen as a problem for many, many generations now.
You mentioned George Eldon Ladd. He's a premillennialist, but non-dispensationalist. So he was like this new voice that said, there's this debate about the kingdom. The dispensationalist says the kingdom is only future. And so he was like, he came up with this thing called already and not yet. We have the kingdom is already, but it's still to come. And it was like this aha moment. And I think a number of Christian pastors in America would say that George Eldon Ladd is perhaps one of the most influential voices that helped them move beyond dispensationalism.
Yeah, that's right. And there was this is some decades old now, but in the 80s, Mark Knoll, the historian, did a poll or as part of a group that did a poll of evangelical pastors across the country, and some hundreds responded. And Ladd's book from, I think it was 1974, called Theology of the New Testament or something like that, was ranked only below, I think, John Calvin's Institutes as the most important book for these pastors. And so it's just a sign that Ladd had certainly a day where he was really significant. And I think you're right to focus in on this idea of the kingdom, and this has real implications for how Christians live out their faith. And so for many dispensationalists, the kingdom of God, the thing that Jesus talked a lot about, the thing that was prophesied in the Old Testament, that this is an entirely future development. This is the millennial kingdom for dispensationalists. And so that had implications for how they viewed politics and social engagement, which is that stuff for kingdom time. Right now, we're just called to evangelize and to get the word out because the end is near, and really thinking that the kingdom is here now and that we should try to engage society in some type of way where we're trying to improve society or reform it. That's mixing purposes. That is not what Christians are called to do. That and they would either associate that with what Israel is called to do because they separate Israel's purpose from the church's purpose, or that's what liberal Protestants want to do, like the social gospel. That's the social gospel type stuff. And so Ladd comes in, and Ladd is very conservative theologically, but he says, actually, that's the wrong way to understand the kingdom. The kingdom is actually here. It's not consummated, so it's not here in full. It's not something that we can actually, make happen. Jesus will come back and consummate it, but it's been inaugurated. It's already here. And so the implications for that, for how you engage with culture, how you engage with higher education, how you engage with politics is much different. It gets you, and this is what Ladd and those evangelicals of his ilk wanted, which is it gets evangelicals thinking about how to witness in universities, in businesses, in places that dispensationalists would find to be entirely secular and not really relevant to spreading the gospel. And if you just fast forward to today, where most of the big voices, either the Tim Kellers or the N.T. Wrights, they all have an inaugurated eschatology that looks a lot more like Ladd's than it does like John Walvoord's or the dispensationalists,
which has implications for our work and our engagement in culture and politics. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about to end us is the war in Gaza. Israel and Christian Americans are they just believe got to support Israel. They're God's chosen people. Isn't that like a pop dispensationalism, like leaking into public policy?
Yeah, well, it's leaking into major pastors who then are pontificating on what U.S. policy should be. I should say I don't know how much. I'm always skeptical that theological categories like dispensationalism or other ones play a role in actual policymakers' decision. I don't know if anyone in the Biden administration is thinking in a dispensationalist way. In fact, I'm very skeptical that that's true. But right. It shapes a broader domestic politics situation that those policymakers do have to respond to. And so I think of in after October 7th, which was when Hamas launched its surprise terrorist attacks against Israel, there were a ton of pastors. I believe that was a Saturday here. And then on that Sunday or the next Sunday, there were a ton of pastors who jumped immediately into trying to fit this event into a prophecy timeline. And that to me is a telltale sign of pop dispensationalism at work, which is there's an eagerness and a quickness to reading some passage about Gog and Magog or something and trying to fit in just the most recent headline into that. And there was a lot of hedging. People weren't super certain exactly what part of a prophecy this fulfilled. But the bigger point was the dispensationalist reading of Scripture actually has something to say about this horrible thing that's happening in the world. And so you should place your trust in a pastor like me because I have a certain insight into what's happening that other Christians don't, because they don't read the Bible literally, or they don't sort of take it as seriously as I do. And that's how that tends to function within a church setting. It does have this knock-on effect that the conversation around what's happening in, not just in that moment in October 7th, but in the broader Arab-Israeli conflict, just becomes entirely, beholden to a theological reading of what's happening there, into these abstract categories of there's a certain group, and it's usually Israel and the U.S. is on God's side, and then everyone else who opposes is on Satan's side, or is at least not on God's side and is working against God's people. And there tend to be sort of defaults toward biblical metaphors around Jacob and Esau, or just the ageless conflict between Jews and Muslims, to make sense of what's happening there, and not actually doing a deep dive into the history of the last 100 years in the region to actually understand the people that are alive today. What are their motives? do those motives, some of them match up with more deeper historical motives. Others are entirely part of the 20th century and things that happened after World War I and World War II, movements of nationalism and natural resources in the region, all that kind of stuff. Most Christians who are thinking about Israel and the Middle East in prophetic terms don't care much about any of that. They care about a prophetic timeline and fitting in things that are happening. And so it really short circuit, I think, the critical thinking that should happen in churches around these issues. And that's not to say that there's no room to think about what the Bible has to say on these things. I wouldn't personally go toward the trying to fit in prophecy fulfillments into them. It's not to say that you shouldn't think about the Bible and only read history books or something like that, but it's about how do you approach the text and how are you approaching the world in a more thoughtful way, rather than a way that just defaults to these categories that have been very popular. They have a lot of seeming authority behind them because they seem to take the Bible really seriously, but really don't capture the complexity of the region or of the political situation here in the U.S.
I think a lot of our society today, especially for younger people, but even older people, we live in a society where we'll see a headline, we'll see a TikTok clip, something on social media, we'll hear something from our pastor and we're like, well, that's truth then. And it's like we're letting that do the work for us. But exactly what you said, we're missing this critical thinking. It's almost being used as a distraction to like, well, I have the answer and here it is. And we just need to, this is our stance here. And we're missing this whole critical thinking. There's so much there that Christians tend to, like you said, just put a prophecy Band-Aid on it, or whatever Band-Aid that they want to put on it, when there's a lot of critical thinking that should go into it. And we should challenge ourselves to have conversations around it, learn.
Social media, or the latest edition of the Decision magazine from the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association shows a picture of Franklin Graham shaking hands with Benjamin Netanyahu, which is, pray for Jerusalem. And it's a tacit approval of what Netanyahu has been doing in Gaza from one of the leading evangelical voices. And it's just like people see this magazine cover like, well, of course, right. I should support Israel.
Right. Yeah, and I really feel for a lot of pastors in this today as well, because I think it's not just that there's bad theology that pastors are preaching. I've talked to a number of pastors who are curious. They don't know. There's a congregant who watched a 1 hour YouTube decoding of what's happening in the Middle East, and then they bring that into the church and say, well, this YouTube thing says this, and this. And, they take the Bible really seriously. What's your response to that? And so then the pastor has to sit there and try to navigate this. And there's always been versions of that. I mean, it's not like pastors have ever sort of, but it's definitely changed in the last few decades where my guess is a lot of Christians are formed, certainly just in the amount of time they spend, by social media, YouTube, other things that who knows where they're coming from theologically and elsewhere. And then they're coming into their churches and expecting and having ways of evaluating their pastors on this that really put the pastors at a disadvantage. So it's a really tough situation. And unfortunately, I mean, this is where I try to end the book. Unfortunately, there are some promising signs, but unfortunately, this is part of the fallenness to me. It's not that it disappeared. It's just that it's become this sort of knee-jerk way that many, many Christians interpret the Middle East for sure, but interpret politics even in the U.S. Through this lens as well.
Well, thanks for joining us, Daniel. I really appreciated your insight. Great book. Love the history. The fact that it was like a lived history for me. It's like when you come to faith in that kind of situation, you're like, well, I have no idea what's going on, and then you start learning about it. Then I'm reading this great history book on it, and it's like, oh man, this is why this happened and why people were talking about this at that time and all that. It's just very fascinating. So I really appreciated it.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to both of you.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel.